So a few weeks ago, I found myself sitting in my automobile. The older I get, the more I find myself in places. I was at a busy intersection waiting for a red light to turn green. And suddenly I realized that the front end of my automobile was right on top of a set of railroad tracks. And I said to myself, girl, you are not the sharpest quill on the porcupine. Why in the world did you allow your automobile to get on top of these tracks? You should have stopped before you got to the tracks. But I was hemmed in by cars all around me. I couldn't back up. I couldn't go forward. And so I sat there waiting for that hour-long 2 minutes to go by. And during those 2 minutes, all I could think about was the possibility of the Santa Fe Railroad coming down that track, picking up my car with me in it, and dragging me all the way to Louisiana. Well, luckily, that did not happen. I went safely through the intersection, was going on down the road, but of course, you know, that scenario just kept playing in my head. And then I thought about a story that I had heard, it was about 15 years ago. That exact same thing had happened to a teenage girl. She lived in Indiana. Now, we'll call her Betty Lou, but that's not her real name. Anyway, Betty Lou was at an intersection waiting for a light, and the front end of her car was right over the edge of the tracks. Well, sure enough, the train came down the tracks. The cattle guard on the front of that engine hooked onto the bumper of her car, and she was being dragged down those tracks at 60 miles an hour. Now, what did Betty Lou do? She got out her cell phone, and she started making phone calls. The first call she made was to her mama. Not 911, no. She called her mama. Now, I heard some of the details about this story because Betty Lou survived that accident. And she went on to the Today Show when she was interviewed by Matt Lauer. And then later, a writer for the Associated Press, Celia Rivenbark, who lives in North Carolina, wrote another story about it, and she told some more details. And so thinking back over those reports and stories, I couldn't help but imagine myself in Betty Lou's position. So when she called up her mama on the phone, I was trying to imagine what that must have sounded like. You see, her mama didn't answer the phone. Her mama didn't hear the phone. She's busy drying her hair. And so Betty Lou left a message. Hey, Mama, it's me. I'm being dragged down some train tracks at 60 miles an hour in my automobile. It's kind of a terrible, dangerous situation, Mama. What you doing? Don't you just hate it when somebody calls you up out of the blue and says, what you doing? I mean, I may be doing things I don't want to talk about, right? You know how it is. I could be cleaning a hairball out of my shower drain. We don't have cats, but we shed a lot around our house. I could be out wiping raccoon slobber off of our outdoor trash cans. Or who knows? Brad Pitt might be having supper at my house. He might be telling me, hey, he's really getting kind of tired of Angelina, and he would like to spend more time with me. Well, if somebody calls me up on the phone right at that moment, I don't care what their situation is. If they say, what you doing? I'm probably just going to say, oh, nothing. What you doing? Right? So anyway, Betty Lou's mama did not hear the phone ring. She's drying her hair, and so Betty Lou left a message. Well, a few minutes later, when the mama turned the dryer off, she saw the message. Well, she tried to listen to it, but there was so much racket on the other end. Sounded like a train, for crying out loud. So she just hung up the phone. Well, I was trying to imagine what it would have been like if I had called my mama like that from a moving train inside my car. Not that I would have had a cell phone when I was 17. Because back in those days, we had telephones, but they were in our houses. And they were attached to the wall by a very short cord. And if you tried to walk away with that receiver in your hand, which is about as big as a grown man's shoe, you could get whiplash being jerked back to that wall where that phone was attached to the jack. But anyway, if I had a cell phone, I can only imagine what it would have been like if I'd called my mama. She would have said to me, well, Barbara Kay, let me get this straight. You are in my Chevy, which I allowed you to drive to the football game because you said you would be very careful. And now you and my Chevy are being dragged down a train track by an engine. Is that about right? Yeah, Mama, that's about the gist of it. And then I know what my mama would say next. She would say to me, well, baby, are you wearing good underwear? I mean, you know I'm right, don't you? Because if you had a Southern mama, you know that most Southern mamas spent an inordinate amount of time and effort worrying about the condition of your underwear, right? My mama, the only thing she worried about more than the condition of my underwear was the fact that when we left our house, we absolutely had to make up our beds. We could not go out of the house without making up the bed because who knows, the house might catch on fire and the firemen would come in and they would see our beds unmade and that would just be tacky. So when she wasn't worrying about unmade beds, she was worrying about underwear. My mama was sure that if I ever got into an accident and I had to be rescued by ambulance personnel, that they were going to take me to the ER, and in every ER in the country, there must be a checklist called condition of underwear. And there were all these little boxes, and you were supposed to check all that apply. Raggedy, clean, stretched out elastic. And every one of those conditions reflected directly upon your mama. Well, anyway, my mama would have then said to me, well, baby, I want you to check and see if it's those nice white undies I got you at JCPenney's. Or is it those fancy ones that your Aunt Juanita gave you for graduation? I'm pretty sure she got them at Neiman Marcus because Juanita is kind of bad about putting on airs. So could you check? And you know, even if a cow landed on the hood of my car as I was being dragged down those tracks, I'd have to get a hold of the label in that underwear and have a look at it. And then if I said to her, yeah, Mama, I'm pretty sure it's from Neiman Marcus. That's what the label says. And Mama, you'll be happy to know that the elastic's in good condition. Well, that would relieve my mama's mind a great deal. And then she would say, well, baby, I'm going to stay here on this phone with you until you get out of this terrible situation. You know, I've always hated train tracks. Did I ever tell you the story about the night you were about to be born and your daddy and I were going to the hospital and we got stopped right there on those train tracks and you nearly got born on top of those tracks? Did I ever tell you that story, baby? And I'd say, yes, ma'am, about 1,000,000 times. But tell it to me again, Mama. And she would. Well, I'm pleased to say that Betty Lou survived her terrible ordeal with only a few bruises and scratches. Her car eventually disconnected from the engine, and some nice people found her and took her to the emergency room. And you know, I read all the reports I could about what happened to that girl, Betty Lou. And I listened to the report that Matt Lauer did on the Today Show. And as best I can tell, nobody ever wrote anything about the condition of Betty Lou's underwear. Now, I hate to judge, but I'm thinking that is a direct reflection upon her mama. Well, it's been almost 50 years ago now, but it feels like yesterday. It was the last week of May, 1966, 3 days after my college graduation and 3 days before my wedding. I was sitting in my mama's kitchen at her old, green, genuine marbleized plastic Formica table. Mama was at the kitchen stove just a few inches away from me. She was cooking supper. Oh, it was going to be a good one, like always. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, gravy, collard greens, cornbread, banana pudding for dessert. Mama said to me, "Baby, I cannot believe that you're going to be getting married in just a few more days." I said, "I know, Mama. I've got so much to do. I'm making a list of everything I got to get done by this weekend." Mama turned around and she was wringing her hands right in front of her calico apron. She said, "Baby, there's something I need to tell you. Something I intended to talk to you about a long time ago, and I just never got around to it, but you are going to get married this weekend, and there are things you need to know. You're going to be a wife. There are things that you should know, that you should be able to do, and the facts of life, baby." And I reached out and I put my hands over my mama's hands and I said, "It's okay, Mama. You don't have to say anything more. I think I already know everything I need to know. My big sisters explained it to me." My mama said, "Your sisters don't know anything about it." Now, my 2 older sisters had been married about 10 years each, and they had a couple of kids each, and so I wasn't sure who was lacking information here. I said, "They don't?" She said, "No, they don't, because I never got around to telling them. I always intended to, but somehow it just kept getting away from me. But I'm going to tell you now, baby. So you pay attention. Do not ever wash a cast iron skillet with soap, because it will flat out ruin it. Are you listening to me?" "Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I am going to give you your grandma's cast iron skillet as a wedding present. It was hers and then it was mine. And it's got about 100 years of seasoning on it. And you don't want to wash that seasoning off. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand." And so sure enough, that weekend I was gifted with my grandma's cast iron skillet. It was beautiful, a lustrous, satiny black. That skillet, it had fried up enough bacon to clog all the arteries in the state of Texas. It had simmered enough gravy to float a battleship. It had fried up enough chicken and okra and potatoes and green tomatoes to feed all the armies of Julius Caesar. That skillet had cradled the finest cornbread known to humankind. And I was afraid to use it. I didn't know how to cook. I got married not knowing how to cook anything. If I had wanted to learn how to cook, I should have stood next to my mama in her kitchen all those years I was growing up and watched how she did it, but I thought I had more important things to do. And so now, here I was, a newlywed, and couldn't cook anything. And my new young husband, he wasn't much of a cook either. And so we learned together. I boiled the water. He measured out the spaghetti. We threw it into that pot. We let it boil until it got mushy. And then we got out our brand new Betty Crocker cookbook that my Aunt Juanita had given us as a wedding present, and we tried to make spaghetti sauce. It was bland. It was tasteless. But we slopped it on top of that mushy spaghetti, and we threw some canned Parmesan cheese on top of the mess, and that was pretty much what we lived on the first 6 months of our marriage. Well, it got to be wintertime that first year we were married, and in February, I came home one day from school. I was teaching second grade. I was feeling real proud of myself that day because we had been studying fables, Aesop's fables, and we had talked about morals, and I thought I'd been real creative about the way I taught that day. So I came home in this creative mood and decided I was going to get out my grandma's cast iron skillet and I was going to make some cornbread for my husband that night. So I got out the skillet, I got out my Betty Crocker cookbook, and I followed Miss Crocker's directions. I got it all mixed up, but instead of pouring it into an 8x8 pan the way she said to, I poured it into the cast iron skillet. And I put it in the oven for about half an hour. And when my husband came home, I told him we were going to have cornbread for supper that night. He was real excited. When I took that cast iron skillet out of the oven, cornbread didn't look right. It was too dark around the edges, and in the middle it was pale. And when we cut into it, it looked like wallpaper paste. But it was all we had except for spaghetti. And so I cut it up into wedges. We glopped butter on top of it, and we ate it that night with our mushy spaghetti. I was so depressed about my failure at cooking cornbread that all I could do was just turn on the television and flop down on the sofa. Now, our apartment was really small. It was really just one big room. And so you could see the television from the kitchen. I was sitting there on the sofa watching the television. My husband, back behind me, decided that he would go ahead and clean up the kitchen. I mean, he could see the TV too. Well, that night, a show came on. It was a new science fiction series we had started watching that fall. It was called Star Trek. And the show that night, it was an amazing, historic episode. It was about, well, you remember the characters, right? It's William Shatner played Captain Kirk, and Leonard Nimoy played Spock. Well, they had almost been captured by this renegade spaceship. The spaceship had these genetically engineered superhumans on it, and they were led by a guy named Khan, who was played by this movie star who talked funny, but he was a fine specimen of a human being, Ricardo Montalban. Well, I sat there watching that show, and when it was over, I was so enthralled, I could hardly get myself up off that sofa. But I finally said to my husband, you know, that was a futuristic fable. I think I could figure out the moral to that if I thought about it long enough. I turned around. My husband was standing at the sink. My grandma's 100-year-old cast iron skillet was in the dish drainer. Water was dripping off of it, and the bottom was rusting before my eyes. My husband was holding up an SOS pad. He told me proudly that he had spent the last hour scrubbing on that skillet with that SOS pad. He said, I believe I got all that crud off of it. Now maybe you can cook cornbread the way your mama did. couldn't breathe. I felt dizzy. I just backed up until I felt a chair behind me. I sat down in that chair and I put my head down between my knees and I began to cry. And then I began to sob. These were the sobs of a young woman from a proud tradition of grease-loving people. People who know that the smell of bacon frying can turn a house into a home. People who know that if you cook a pan of biscuits with a pound of lard, that the lard will turn the biscuits and the people who eat them fluffy all over. People who believe that gravy is a beverage. People who understand that a cast iron skillet with 100 years of seasoning on it is not just an antique. It's not just an heirloom. It is a work of art. Finally, I lifted my face and I looked at my husband and I wanted to shout at him. I wanted to say, "What is wrong with you? Were you raised by Klingons?" But I bit my lip. And I said to him, "Honey, you are never supposed to wash a cast iron skillet with any kind of soap. Don't you know the facts of life?" Think of it as Starfleet's prime directive. Do not impose your ideals on a primitive society. Do not interfere with history. My husband asked me if he could buy me a new cast iron skillet, maybe as a belated Valentine's present. I said, "No. I want my grandma's skillet back, the one with all the crud on it. That crud was my grandma's kitchen soul." Oh, bless his heart. My husband got on the telephone and he called my mama. She lived 300 miles away, and back in those days, long distance was expensive. But son-in-law guilt is a powerful thing. He asked my mama, explaining to her, yes, that he was an ignoramus and had ruined the skillet. But he asked her if there was anything he could do to restore it to its former glory. And my mama told him exactly what to do. She said it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take months. But he better get started on it right away before the rust got any worse. Well, he did. That night, my husband greased that skillet down real good. He put it in a 250-degree oven. He left it there for several hours. He took it out before we went to bed. The next night, he did the same thing. Night after night after night, he cared for that skillet. We went home at Easter to visit my folks, and he took the skillet with us to show it to my mama. Asked her if he was doing things right, and she assured him that he was, but he had to keep on doing it. And then he spent all one Saturday afternoon standing next to my mama in her kitchen, watching her cook biscuits and cornbread, because she didn't cook with recipes. He tried to figure out exactly how she cooked everything she made that afternoon. Well, a few months later, May of 1967, we celebrated our first anniversary. My anniversary present was my grandma's cast iron skillet, restored to that beautiful satiny black that it had once been. And inside that cast iron skillet, my husband had baked cornbread, as close as he could make to my mama's cornbread. And on top there was a little note that said, "I'm just a fool in love with you." Lyrics from my favorite song of the day. Teen angel, will you be mine? You know, I feel really lucky that when I was a very young woman, I learned the facts of life from my mama. Back in the day when my husband and I and William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy were all young and ready to boldly go where we had never gone before. I know to this day, new isn't always better. Shiny is overrated. Some things just get better with age. Y'all, live long and prosper.